Hello, I'm Carol Smaldino, and welcome to The Human Climate. My guest today is Larry Siems. Larry Siems is the author of Between the Lines, Letters Between Undocumented Mexican and Latin American Immigrants and Their Families and Friends in 1995. The Torture Report, what the documents say about America's post 9/11 torture program, and that's 2011. He's the editor of Guantanamo Diary by Mohamedou Slahi in 2015, and co-author of The Actual True Story of Ahmed and Zarga with Mohamedou Slahi in 2021. So welcome.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm going to start by asking you, how did you become interested and compelled by the subject of torture, and compelled, as I see it, to know the truth behind what happened?
I think I came to this because torture, the story of torture in America is also a censorship story. And, for many, many years, I have done human rights work that's particularly focused on freedom of expression, which is, our First Amendment in the United States guarantees the right to freedom of speech and expression, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights guarantees free expression to every citizen on Earth. I worked for an organization called PEN, the International Writers Organization, PEN, where we did advocacy on behalf of writers and journalists around the world who were threatened or persecuted for their work. Many of them were imprisoned. And so that was, and I traveled a lot internationally. I worked with, free expression advocates around the world. Many of the writers on whose behalf we were working who were jailed were also tortured. And so, when in a post 9/11 world, working for PEN America in New York City, like all human rights organizations, I think that were based in the United States after 9/11, when news started to surface of the mistreatment of prisoners, of violations of the laws of war, of all of these things, we could see an immediate impact on our effectiveness as international human rights advocates. I mean, within weeks, days, I would say even hours of the passage of the USA Patriot Act in September of 2001, there were dictators around the world who were, citing the US anti-terror policies to support their own repressive policies that included massive persecution of democratic voices and writers. So, it was very difficult to be an American human rights advocate and not, be aware of what was happening in the United States. And that awareness was limited by the intensity of the censorship that surrounded, the U.S. torture program. And obviously that was intentional. The censorship existed in order to allow torture to happen. It can't happen without censorship, theoretically, at least in a democracy, because it's absolutely prohibited by international law, by the Convention Against Torture, which specifically says that you can't, no exigency can be cited as a justification for torture. You can't, even a national emergency does not justify the use of torture. So, it was required, the US, in order to torture, had to create these secret spaces, and then to carry out the torture, and then secrecy was used both to keep those secrets and to continue to hold people who had had no business holding in order to keep them silent. So, that was the broad outlines of what was happening. We knew that. And we at Penn started to do some work with the ACLU, which had done this enormously successful Freedom of Information Act request that had pried loose over 100,000 pages of documents from the US Department of Defense, from the CIA, from the FBI, which was this huge repository of information about prisoner abuse in Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And so I worked with them on a project that became the Torture Report. And in the course of the Torture Report, the story of this man, Mohamedou Slahi, surfaces prominently in the documents because he was one of the most tortured people in Guantanamo. He was one of two people who were designated as special projects, quote unquote, by Donald Rumsfeld, and whose special projects treatment was meticulously documented. So it was, by contact with those documents that I first learned of Mohamedou, and the fact that he had actually had a manuscript that was locked away somewhere because it too was, completely censored. And then as you said, in about 2012, his attorneys contacted me right about the time I was wrapping up the torture report work to say that they had managed to get the manuscript, Mohamedou's manuscript, declassified, although not uncensored, heavily redacted. And so that became then the Guantanamo Diary.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, you were talking about the prohibition against torture, which I really didn't know about until, I guess, you're talking about the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. And I guess I was surprised that there was no exception to that. No exception, a threat of war, internal political instability, or other public emergency. There was absolutely no exception.
It has to be that way because any exception would swallow the rule.
Right.
People who torture generally don't think they're doing a bad thing. They don't believe they're bad guys. They believe that it's the ticking time bomb scenario that people always use. We're doing this in order to save lives, or even in the crudest form, I'm doing this in order to preserve my power, but I'm doing that because my power is the power my country needs, right? So any line drawing around this, makes it absolutely unworkable. And it's also based on, like all, our international and domestic sense of human and civil rights. They're based on natural law system of belief that, each individual inherently possesses certain rights. That's what being human means. And among those are the right to be free from torture. That's just, everybody possesses that right. And there's no circumstances under which that right can be abridged.
I wonder, could you, first of all, just say what the initials for the ACLU are?
American Civil Liberties Union.
Yeah. So from the very beginning, were you aware of the role of the American Psychological Association?
Well, from the very beginning, I wouldn't say nobody was from the very, very beginning, but as soon as, 2005, I think, was when Dana Priest published an article in the Washington Post that, exposed the fact that there were secret CIA prisons in Europe. By 2008, with the documents that the ACLU had secured, among them were a CIA Inspector General report, an internal report investigating allegations of abuse at those sites. All of those reports, early reports on, talked about the role of two psychologists, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, in developing this enhanced interrogation program. And, so I would say by 2008, which was, before I started the Torture Report project, by 2008, it was well known that, that there was a troubling overlap between, the psychological professionals and the torture program. So, the details of that have become ever more clear through time. And then the role about the larger community, mental health community in the United States and professional organizations, and not censoring that when they had the chance, or not speaking out forcefully enough, is a really interesting subject, a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I know, that I've talked to many members of the associations who, have done a lot of work to, push even further for official apologies and that sort of thing.
Well, I've been particularly interested in the American Psychological Association, even though I'm a social worker. I was at one of the meetings in New York where they discussed whether psychologists should be present at what they were already calling enhanced interrogations. So, and they didn't vote that down at the time. It was about
Right.
2007. And it's clear that the Americans, I mean, it's very important that the American Psychological Association, whose key principle is do no harm,
Right.
really fostered and supported and sustained the torture policy of the Bush administration by declaring that this was not torture, but enhanced interrogation, and that people were not, who were in custody were not prisoners.
Right.
So they were not liable to be protected. I mean, they weren't protectable.
Right.
They were detainees. And so, yeah, it's very, very, very disturbing. And this is written up by James Risen and Jane Mayer and a host of other people. And finally, I mean, I think this is important. Finally, the American Psychological Association, under such criticism, and some of the leaders just did stand up. They hired a legal firm to investigate, and the legal, it's called the Hoffman Report. Just in case anybody is interested, it's about 528 pages, and it is in the smallest print possible, and it's available to the public. And it is the most boring document, also because these people are not psychologists, they're lawyers. So, I mean, I guess I found it very, very, very disturbing, just being a mental health professional, to see, in a sense, so few people almost aware, I mean, so many people seemed oblivious. And there's one Martin Seligman, who was the past president of
Right.
the Psychological Association. Every book that documents torture says that he had a meeting in October 2001, and he had leaders of the military and leaders of the psychological community, including Bruce Jessen and James Mitchell. He allegedly was going to do counterterrorism work, but apparently he says that even though, if you look up learned helplessness, which was his theory, and torture, you'll see material on the web that he would never have used that against people. But I guess I wanted just to mention that, because
it's a hugely important, in the context of the larger conversation about reckoning with this, how do we find a path back that, repairs the damage? Obviously, the mental health professional community in the United States has work to do in finding that path back, the acknowledgements and everything, like many other communities, I think. But there's a terrific new documentary film out by Alex Gibney called The Forever Prisoner, which really looks, specifically at the interrogation of Abu Zubaydah, who was sort of the alpha or the beta with the test case for Mitchell and Jessen's crackpot ideas. Has really startling interview footage with them, or footage from their deposition, in a really great case that the ACLU brought on behalf of two survivors of CIA black sites, and the family of a third who was actually killed during torture in Afghanistan. But one of the most striking things about that movie, which is also in the documents, illustrated quite clearly, is that James Mitchell had language to describe what he was doing, but when they did these things, it was deeply disturbing even to them. When they were torturing Abu Zubaydah using the enhanced interrogation techniques, including waterboarding in Thailand, and that we now have ever less redacted, more full record of the minute by minute what was happening, during that interrogation. There are many references to interrogators breaking down and crying, feeling physically sick. Several asked to be sent home to the United States. Mitchell has said repeatedly that he was asking headquarters to stop, and they were pushing him to keep going. They actually sent somebody from Washington. Mitchell has said, enough, we're not going to waterboard him anymore. They didn't believe that he was not still withholding information, and sent somebody from Washington, their head lawyer, to watch over yet one more waterboarding session, till they too, I think, were appalled by what waterboarding actually means in the flesh, and said, okay, you can stop. But there's the difference between what people thought they were doing and the actual practice of it, between the efficacy they claimed and the complete efficacy that they lack of efficacy that revealed itself. By the end of Abu Zubaydah's interrogation, Mitchell and Jessen were not saying these EITs were effective because they got a bunch of new information, but in fact that they proved that he didn't have any further information, which is awful when you think about it. But that's
Can you just say what waterboarding is?
Well, waterboarding is, the shorthand that people use is simulated drowning. I've heard people say that it's simulated only to the extent that you're revived. You're not allowed to, people don't allow you to drown, but physically what's happening is that you are drowning. It's just that the process doesn't go to completion, but you are, the way it was done, in the CIA's interrogation booths was that it was, extremely calculated. They had a gurney that would tip up and down. They would lower the gurney to a horizontal position. You were strapped down. They put a cloth over your mouth, and then they were pouring water into that cloth into your mouth at a prescribed rate, until you were choking, until you were beginning to drown. And then they would tip you up. They would, the table would tip up to a vertical position. You would cough and sputter and recover yourself, and then they'd flip you right back down and do it again. My understanding is that it's, it's the physical experience of the person being waterboarded is the experience of drowning. We know that Abu Zubaydah was, deeply physically traumatized by this. He was, sick. He had to be hospitalized at one point.
He lost an eye.
Yeah, that was earlier, but yeah. Physically, it's permanently scarring. It's clearly torture. Everybody agrees on that. They're continuing hearings in Guantanamo for al-Nashiri, the accused coal bomber, who was one of 5 people who we know got the most severe of the EITs. And I think in proceedings this week, one of his healthcare professionals talked about the fact that he still has recurring nightmares of drowning. So it is an extremely gruesome process, so gruesome, as I say, that the people who are participating in that process are the ones who I think, as much as anyone, were responsible for stopping the practice.
Although I don't know if this remorse or this horror, if they come in spurts, because the last I read about James Mitchell, he was at a hearing and he was very defiant. He was very aligned with the families of the victims of 9/11, and he was defiant about doing this for them and for his country. And I think
absolutely. I think he believes that. He believes that to this day. I don't think I can't remember the exact year, but there was a whole internal review of the EITs that the Bush administration did.
Can you say what is an EIT?
Enhanced interrogation technique.
Okay.
And that's this list of 10 techniques that Mitchell and Jessen developed. And there was a huge review of that at some point. And even in Mitchell's book, his own autobiography, he describes that they had come to the conclusion that, they only needed about 3 of them that were really effective. That included walling, pounding somebody off the wall, also deeply traumatizing physically. But that waterboarding was not on that list. So, I think, he would, I don't put words into his mouth. I cannot begin to imagine, the internal life of James Mitchell, but I think he would, you can have both of those things, right? Well, we were doing the best we could. We thought this worked. We were learning, but the reason we were doing this was a noble cause. And, again, we're back to the beginning of the conversation. The Convention Against Torture says no noble cause is an excuse for torture. So, if we had that bright line, and that bright line was, established and held by the top levels of the Bush administration, James Mitchell would not have been, in a position where he was sitting down at a typewriter and inventing crazy ideas that became the EMPs.
I mean, I hesitate because what they called this was learned helplessness, and the it was based apparently on the work of Seligman, who did torture on dogs, and the idea was that you tortured a dog to the point that the dog felt no option of escape, even if the door was open.
Right.
Dog would not take the opportunity. So, well,
that was, Mitchell and Jessen, and I think on up throughout the Bush administration, had this notion that, it was, they were learned helplessness was the response to a problem that they had identified as resistance, right? That, that they had this kind of ill-conceived notion that Al-Qaeda members were kind of super resistors, had been trained in the most sophisticated, interrogation resistance techniques. So they had to break down that wall. It's nonsense. First of all, there was no such formal training. That they're as susceptible as anybody to, both to, rapport building, positive, effective interrogation techniques, and as, susceptible to the tremendous harms of torture, and as everyone else, including the, the efficacy harm of false confessions, which is the inevitable byproduct of torture. Torture does not give you good information. But they had this misguided notion that they had to break people in order to break their resistance. And, the cables from Thailand describing Abu Zubaydah's torture illustrate in the most shocking way the way in which they enacted that on a specific person. So to the point that they would just sort of point to a confinement box, these small boxes that—
like a coffin.
Yes. One even smaller. One was coffin size. That was a large confinement box. There was a smaller one, which is basically would be the size of you in a fetal position. But they would point to the box, and this would describe Abu Zubaydah crawling across the room and getting into the box himself. And that was what they were doing. But the effect was, not at all what they, claimed it was in terms of getting useful information. Even if they had gotten useful information, it doesn't matter, because it still is clearly a violation of human dignity and international law. So,
well, from what I read here, that his interrogators pushed him so hard, including sleep deprivation and physical abuse, that at one point they were scared he might die. And
Yeah, he was rushed to a hospital.
Yeah. And they, let's see, and they sent a cable that if he died, he should be cremated immediately. And that they actually said that if he survived the experience, they should be protected from incriminations and he should remain in isolation and incommunicado so
Well,
that
that's the second part of this censorship regime, right? And that, that I mean, Alex Gibney's film is titled "The Forever Prisoner," exactly on that quote, right? That we would have to hold him, he would have to be held incommunicado forever, because otherwise he will tell this unbelievably damning story of criminal misbehavior. I mean, and this is, you can look at this as the story of Guantanamo as well. So Guantanamo, opens in January of 2002. It's pretty full by August of 2002. At which point in August of 2002, there's all these these extravagant claims about all of the high level terrorists that we've got in Guantanamo, but the CIA does an internal audit where they send an analyst, an Arabic speaking analyst, into Guantanamo to just figure out who they've got there. He does an internal report in August of 2002 that says the vast majority of these people, we have no business holding them.
wow.
They're farmers, they're people, they were militia people in Afghanistan. There's been ongoing conflict forever. None of the, they had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks that were, or organizations that were planning hostilities against the United States. There were different Mujahideen factions that were fighting in Afghanistan. Some of them were just totally wrong person, wrong time, complete mistaken identity. But instead of, rethinking that strategy, Rumsfeld and decided that the Defense Department, they were hearing all these great claims of success that are coming from the CIA and Mitchell and Jessen's program. So Rumsfeld decides we're going to do the same thing, starts their own sort of special interrogation program, which culminates in these, in the torture first of Mohammed al-Qahtani, and then in January of 2003, and then Mohamedou in the fall and winter of 2003. But we could say that, okay, well, they were wrongheaded about who they thought Mohamedou was, but by 2004, 2005, they knew perfectly well that they had the wrong man.
Can I just read something about him?
Sure.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, there was this is a page 322 of the torture report. You describe a memo by General Miller shortly after another memo by Donald Rumsfeld, seeming to almost negate the actual usage of the torture program. It discusses the intention of treatment torture of Mohamedou Slahi. And I'm quoting you. Slahi was to face 20-hour interrogations, during which interrogators would douse him with water to keep him awake and enforce control. Military dogs would be used to agitate the detainee and provide shock value. He would wear signs saying liar, coward, and dog, and be forced to perform dog tricks to reduce the detainee's ego. He would be forcibly shaved, strip searched, and made to wear a burqa. He would be refused opportunities to pray, and interrogators would exploit religious taboos like close contact with female interrogators to raise his stress levels. Moreover, because Slahi believes music is forbidden, his interrogation booth and a bare white room designed to reduce outside stimuli and present an austere environment. It would then be flooded with loud music and lurid red lighting. At other times, a strobe light would be used to disorient him and add to his stress level. So I guess it's a little overwhelming even to read.
I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, it's remarkable to understand how premeditated these things were. I think it's one of the great mysteries to me in my human rights career. It was a great mystery, but this experience answered that riddle for me. But you know, over the past latter half of the 20th century, as countries around the world have experienced, you know, a movement from authoritarian regimes to some kind of freedom, you know, and have really dealt with this question of accountability, reckoning with torture and other human rights abuses. Time and time again, this happened in Argentina, it happened in Brazil, it's happened in, you know, in East Germany. When there's these, you know, when the oppressive regime falls, it's warehouses full of documents are discovered that are their torture records. And it was, for me, a confounding mystery why people kept such meticulous records of such horrible things. It became clear, you know, as I was working on this and you know, sort of looking at this documentary record, that this is a record. There's two parts to it. Most of the documentary record we have about torture in these places is because there were internal whistleblowers. You know, so these are, you know, the records are the internal investigations that were done. The description that you just read, for example, of Mohamedou's interrogation plan, which was modified slightly from the time that original version, but was signed personally by Rumsfeld. You know, that was exposed in this remarkable 2008 report by the Senate Armed Services Committee, essential report on torture in Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And then there was an FBI internal report where the FBI was so riven by, you know, by anguish over what was happening in the sites and whether or not FBI agents should be allowed to participate in it. And so we have this record. So on the one hand, there's, you know, all of the, you know, these are just people who filed complaints, and, you know, the inspectors general followed up on those complaints. And so we have these documents were all internal. But then the other ones, like, why did James Mitchell, for however many days Abu Zubaydah was tortured, at the end of every day, did he sit down and type out and send back to headquarters, you know, minute by minute, literally blow by blow descriptions of what they were doing to Abu Zubaydah? You know, well, it becomes clear that this is ass covering, right? By putting it on the record, you're establishing that you're reporting it up the chain of command. You're not going rogue. You're not a bad apple, you know. So that the torturers, I think, tend to do this because it in some ways it feels like, you know, it establishes a chain of command that you're in. And yes, the CIA lawyers said this is legal, so I'm doing it because they said it's legal, and I'm reporting it. So you're not stopping me, so therefore you must agree that it's legal. And, you know, in fact, we know that the headquarters was actually pressuring Mitchell to push even harder. So that's it is a strange phenomenon, but we do have this, you know, this incredible trove of documents, but even that continues to be obscenely censored. You know, the Senate Intelligence Committee, you know, released its report in 2014, all right, I believe, on CIA torture. And to this day, we've only seen the executive summary. There are 5 more volumes of the details that go into that executive summary that apparently nobody's ever going to get to read. Shocking. And, you know, and just one more point, sorry. You know, in order to do this, you know, to continue to perpetuate this censorship, required holding, like we said, Abu Zubaydah and Mohamedou Slahi and a number of people essentially try to hold them forever. For Mohamedou, they held him for at least 10 years beyond the time that anybody could reasonably have said that he was who they had said he was. He was who they believed he was. Yeah. And they did that simply because Mohamedou is a tremendous communicator, and they knew that when he was released, his story would be internationally known.
Yeah. Well, as I was looking over the notes for today, I hadn't thought about this for a while, but, as a Jew coming up, hearing about the Holocaust, it was, and, seeing so many movies, it was like they were terrible and we would never do anything like that. And then I picked up a book by Carl Jung, who said that the Holocaust was a logical situation that came from the atrocities between Europeans, and then came from colonialism and slavery and genocide. It was like, holy, and so I have kind of bought into his theory of the shadow, that we're all capable of good and bad, all kinds of good and bad, and that if we don't get to know that, we can dehumanize, we can project all our terrible parts onto other people. And once that happens, we can be elected as special enough to do whatever we want to them. And so there's a terrible, I think, illness in this country of not being able to own, whether it's systemic racism, whether it's torture, and to apologize, to say we are not always the good guys. And, to get anywhere, we have to kind of know that. And to get really further, we have to kind of know that we're capable of all kinds of things. So that, for instance, I've read a bunch of information about what the torture program has done to our reputation in the world, and how it's fomented and exaggerated, informed ISIS. And, once you humiliate people at their core, and I think from what I've read, the humiliation of dogs around, the humiliation of being peed on, the humiliation of women being just trying to seduce, just, I want to fuck you, just like, it's so humiliating. And that what people really feel humiliated, aside from just any kind of torture,
right?
They feel
and by the way, speaking of wrong-headed ideas, those things in particular, dogs and sexual molestation by female officers, that was the product of another absolutely harebrained, frankly racist conception that, Muslim men for some reason are particularly vulnerable to those things. Sexual assault is traumatizing for anyone. Fear of attack dogs is pretty universal, So, but there was some notion that these were, part of how you break down, again, this kind of particular kind of person. But it was, these are just things that, like you say, are deeply humiliating to everyone. They're violations of human dignity in the most direct and straightforward way. And they're clearly prohibited by international law.
In terms of, you're talking about the forever prisoner, I just wanted to mention, because I think, the idea of torture is so abominable, to me, and I think to many, but the idea of the PTSD, I think, doesn't always come through. So I just wanted to mention from an article by James Risen. He wrote this in 2016, and it was called "After Torture, Ex-Detainee is Still Captive of the Darkness." And he writes, the United States subjected Suleiman Abdullah Salim to harsh tactics in a secret prison and held him without charge for years. He was found not to be a terrorist threat, but he pays a deep price to this day. Suleiman Abdullah Salim endured beatings, sleep deprivation, waterboarding, and other severe measures. It has been 13 years since he was tortured in a secret prison in Afghanistan run by the CIA, a place he calls the darkness. It has been 8 years since he was released. No charges, no explanations, back into the world. Even after so much time, Mr. Salim, 45, is struggling to move on, suffering from depression and post-traumatic stress. According to a medical assessment, he is withdrawn and wary. He cannot talk about his experiences with his wife, who he says worries that the Americans will come back to snatch him. He is fearful of drawing too much attention at home in Stone Town in Zanzibar, Tanzania, concerned that his neighbors will think he is an American spy. When he speaks not in his native Swahili, but in English that he has learned from the jailers, Mr. Salim nearly whispers. Many times now, I feel I have something heavy inside my body, he said in an interview. Sometimes I walk and I forget. I forget everything. I forget prison, the darkness, everything, but it is always there. The darkness comes. He was one of 39 men subjected to some of the CIA's most brutal techniques: beatings, hanging in chains, sleep deprivation, and water dousing, which creates a sensation of drowning, even though interrogators had been denied permission to use that last tactic on him, according to Senate Intelligence Committee investigators into the agency's classified interrogation program. In a series of recent interviews in Dubai, Mr. Salim described his incarceration by the CIA and the United States military as a terrorist suspect. His account closely parallels those provided by other detainees, witnesses, and court documents. Today, back in Stone Town, Mr. Salim is trying to support his family, though some of his attempts at jobs have not worked out. He now breeds pigeons, raising them for a local market. They are both his livelihood and his solace. And it's like, as I'm reading that, I'm getting the chills, because I think some of the human aspect is after.
Well, this, that case, that man, it's such an important and compelling illustration of the thing that you were talking about a little while ago, about our almost adolescent inability to repair the damage that we do. Suleiman Salim was one of the 3 plaintiffs in that ACLU lawsuit I mentioned against Mitchell and Wesson. And I wrote a piece for The Nation that described this absolutely shameful process during that lawsuit, where you presumably have your ability to sue in court for damages which are required under the Convention Against Torture to be awarded to people who have been tortured. Right. Normally this would mean that you would be, give a deposition, come to the United States, give your deposition, and then come and be in the courtroom to meet, to come face to face with the torturer in front of a jury. That sort of drama of communal truth-telling and recognition, right? When it came time for Suleiman to give his deposition, he was not allowed to come to the United States. His attorneys had to depose him on a Caribbean island after this long process of trying to work out where and how they could do these depositions outside of the United States. But to this day, no one who was held in Guantanamo or in a CIA black site has been allowed to come to the United States. When Mohamedou was still in prison, his brother Jodie, who lives in Germany, who has never even had the shadow of suspicion over him. Beautiful, lovely, gentle, kind young man, was invited to come to the United States by Amnesty International and some other organizations to speak on his brother's behalf. Jodie, I went to pick him up at JFK and was stopped at the at immigration and put on a flight back to Germany. So this is, we're talking about, the kind of censorship, and that censorship has involved the systematic extinguishing of the voices of those we tortured and of their families, and a deliberate ongoing attempt to keep them out of the arena of public discourse in the United States. Not knowing these things, I would look at the conversation that's going on now about critical race theory and shake my head in total bewilderment. But in fact, it's the same thing. Critical race theory is essentially a conversation. It's essentially a conversation about acknowledging and repairing damage.
Right.
How do we acknowledge our historical wrongs? How do we weave a more durable and fair and equitable blanket that warms us all? And the responses of many in the country is to actually prohibit that conversation, to pass laws prohibiting people from having that conversation in public schools. I mean, that the idea that, we are so deeply guilt-ridden about what we've done, that we're just structurally incapable of having conversations that can rescue us from our own shame and guilt. It's just one of it's probably the defining pathology of this moment.
Right, I agree. So, and that we're so brittle. So it's interesting because, many people on the right call many people on the left snowflakes, hypersensitive, hyper this, hyper that. But the, this, I actually write this in my book because it struck me as so bizarre, but in terms of what we're talking about, it's not so bizarre. I mean, it's kind of commonplace. I was reading about Putin and how he had spoken with the heads of education to get them to teach the more positive aspects of Stalin, who, I don't know, 20 million, 30 million people he was accused of having executed. So, but the idea was to teach more about his rescuing Allied forces in World War II and to make him more of a hero, because he wanted the students to have better self-esteem. So really what it's also about is to get better self-esteem, don't learn the truth, and don't help our children really be able to get the tools to digest some of the sadness and remorse and regret and the good parts of guilt. I mean, certainly those of us who were Jewish, let me just say that, have wanted German people to do that work. And so, but here, it's very, very hard to embrace it because we think that we're so strong, but really the idea of exceptionalism is such a kind of brittle one.
It is, I mean, it's so true. And I think, we're at best bullies. Our strength is bully strength in a lot of ways. Our country is such an enormously powerful and influential country around the world, even today, even in spite of these shameful episodes. But that's largely, the positive power that we exhibit is what, they would call soft power, which is our cultural, influence over the world, our entertainment, our technology, our creative products and everything. But the other side, I mean, I keep thinking, and I know this is simplistic and I don't have a, psychology background, but, I do think of the analogy of, the lesson the classic lesson that you learn when you throw a ball through the neighbor's window,
Yeah.
and the good parenting is, taking your child and walking them over to the neighbor's house to ring the doorbell to say, I'm sorry, I threw a ball through your window. Right. And, anybody who's had an experience like that, and I had many when I was a child, that as long as you're running, away from that, you're weak. You're afraid of being caught. You become secretive. You become anxious. As soon as you ring that doorbell and say that, an enormous weight is lifted. You gain strength. You're seen as somebody who's courageous enough to admit a mistake. The world is just desperate for an America that's courageous enough and mature enough to commit its mistakes, because all other countries have committed a ton of mistakes too, so it's not, the exceptionalism thing is, forget it. All countries go astray, but what the world would wish for from the United States is a country that can model, a durable version of democracy, and a durable version of democracy requires accountability. That's a simple fact.
It's a little like the conversation around toxic masculinity, the idea being that a really strong man is a man who can accept his weakness. But
Right.
Can I bring you back to Mohamedou? Because I
Sure.
think, even though I say, I don't think he should be the poster child because he was so resilient, he has so many strengths, but he is like a therapeutic image and being in a way for this country, because you cannot help see him and see him say that his religion helped him through, that because of his background, he believes in the power of love, that he's willing to have everybody come to his table, no matter what they did, and speak about it. I'm getting chills again. So, and many people have not heard of the movie The Mauritanian. And I'm not saying it's the best movie I've ever seen, but I think it's kind of spectacular in that it should be seen. It should be kind of required. And I remember saying to him that I didn't really like the title because I didn't really understand it. And he said he liked the title because he wanted people to find out about his country, Mauritania. But I think there is also nothing quite like seeing some of the images. And one of the things I say to people, aside from the fact that I'll pay them to see the movie, or I'll pay the Amazon fee, if it's still a fee, is that it's just, first of all, I assure people that it is not a thriller, and that it does not submit the audience to endless views of torture. I think it's just enough for you to get a sense that this was real. And so, can you say anything about the movie aside from everybody see it, please?
I mean, I think it's very powerfully done. This is based on the Guantanamo Diary, Mohamedou's book, and he was very active in, I actually got to see them filming the scenes that were shot at his mother's house,
Wow.
including the heartbreaking scene where he says goodbye to his mother before he's disappeared and spirited off to Jordan for the first round of CIA orchestrated interrogations, which is the last time he saw his mother, because she died in prison when he was in Guantanamo, and they were very close. But so I mean, I can't say anything other than see it. I think it's an incredibly important, account that does by inference rather than explicit, depictions, really does on a visceral level communicate the intensity of the emotional and physical trauma that we subjected him and others to. I want to talk for a second, though. You mentioned Mohammed is inviting people to tea and his forgiveness, I mean, the first thing he said, and I think it might be in the clip at the end of the film, but, when he gave a press conference, first press conference when he was back in Mauritania, and he said that he's forgiven everybody that's done this, I saw him 3 weeks later. I was able to, get there 3 weeks after he was out. We spent time together, and I was sort of like, really, that was very clever, very clever, nice PR, really good. I see what you're doing there. But really, have you forgiven us? And he said, sure, absolutely, 100%, but he went on to explain that, and I've, and this is a really important point. His forgiveness is part of his self-liberation. He forgives us in order to remove himself from the oppression of our refusal to take responsibility for what we do. He would be imprisoned to us for the rest of his life if he's waiting for us to apologize to him, to make reparations.
I'm sorry, keep going.
And so, but when he forgives us, he steps out of that cycle, right? I've forgiven them. I'm done with them. I wish them the best, but it doesn't let us off the hook.
No, absolutely.
Because the next round of forgiveness is us forgiving ourselves.
Absolutely.
And we can only forgive ourselves by, an open, frank accountability process that includes, being very, very honest about not only about who did what, who ordered what, who turned a blind eye to what, but also what we as the American people, signaled and didn't signal in terms of support for all of this. I mean, George Bush very famously called the 2004 presidential election, his re-election, he called that his accountability moment. We already had the Abu Ghraib photographs. We had reports of what was going on in the CIA black sites. We knew what we knew, and he was elected president again. And so, there was certainly, and you will hear Dick Cheney, you'll hear Bruce Jessen or James Mitchell, right. Mitchell especially, say, we were doing the things that you wanted us to do, and we need, a real accountability process is one that, society-wide talks about how afraid we were, how angry we were, what we thought that entitled us to be able to do, how Islamophobic we were.
Yep.
And all of these things and so that's, so Mohamedou's forgiveness is real, it's genuine, it's profound, it's glorious, it's awe-inspiring, but that only takes care of his side of it for him.
No, absolutely.
Doesn't do anything for us.
Absolutely. But, I think I'm thinking of TikTok. I have a therapy client who keeps sending me TikToks and I think of that saying, I don't think you're going on TikTok anytime soon, but I think, that idea of forgiving as a way of getting out of the cycle of violence and is so important to many people, even an individual.
Absolutely.
But yeah. I do want to say, and I really had no intention of giving any PR to anything, but I do want to recommend the Guantanamo Diary, because again, it's actually a beautiful read in the sense that it does not hit you over the head. And because of Mohamedou's clarity and because of his humor, he's wry, and because of your editing, it really comes through as a benign, it's provocative, there's no doubt about it, but you don't feel tortured. And I think this is very important, that these things in the media, like the film, The Mauritanian and Guantanamo Diary, are not elements of torture. They are not as assaultive as we have been. And they don't express the violence of the torture in the same way. So I think I think people need to know, and I think as a Jew, and I'm really not religious, except, who knows what's in my unconscious. I think about the holiday of Yom Kippur, which is next year, but I think in terms of atoning and apology, I think we need to make ourselves, larger and not just think of, have I sinned against another Jew? As part of humanity, what am I committing and what am I part of? And yeah, so I mean, it's Christmas, and I think, sometimes I think, well, what would Jesus do? He would do, again, I'm Jewish, so I'm assuming. I am so assuming because it was a long time ago, but that, the spirit maybe of this holiday is not just peace on earth and presence, but really doing our job, to make for something peaceful and doing our job. And, part of that is asking forgiveness, but not just asking forgiveness in a mechanical way, but doing the work. And so I think we're good. Larry. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I just, amen. I mean to that. I mean, it's really true. I think, we're in a bad spot. We're so deeply divided, but I think, we need to rebuild communities. We need to rebuild, our sense of human dignity and shared human purpose. And this is an avenue,
Yeah.
This is a really, really important avenue. I mean, the people who are so afraid of these discussions, it's a misguided fear, because it's not, and I think it's based on a kind of deeply embedded narrative of scarcity, where there's just, if my group loses a little bit of advantage, if somebody else gets more advantages or gets a more equal shot, it's going to diminish my stature and my possibilities. And that's not how it works. That is not how it works. Right. If we're, a system that's based on, on marginalizing and oppressing people, is one that creates deep divides, as we see, and real harms. The traumas that that this country has been historically inflicted live on. They live on. We don't have to. It's true that we were not slaveholders, but that the ways in which slavery shaped all of our institutions, we have to acknowledge that. We have to think about, what can we do today that addresses, those deeply ingrained injustices and inequalities, and doing that is going to make us, wealthier in every sense.
Well, the ironic thing is that with the exceptionalism comes a lack of empathy, and with the lack of empathy comes a lack of vulnerability. And then what happens is that we can't feel vulnerable to climate change. So you have so many people either feeding into it actively or not caring about it or denying it. So it's like, are we going to be vulnerable and, for real, with all the mess that entails, not as a show business kind of thing, but in a very real way, and help each other and get the help we need.
Absolutely. And there's so many, there's so many positive lessons out there in how the outcomes of this are only good, and I'll just, I'll end with this story, which is, when Mohamedou was still in prison and, the book had come out when he was still in Guantanamo, and I would do, book talks and things. During the Q&A, there was always a question from the audience about, they would say, well, okay, I'm beginning to come around to the view that Mohamedou was mistakenly imprisoned and should never have been tortured, but what if he gets out now? He must be so angry. I mean, it just like it won't he be dangerous if he's released now? And it was like, you mentioned empathy, which is what made me think of it. It was like, I always loved getting that question, because it begins in a kind of empathy, right? It begins by saying, wow, this was the magnitude of this injustice, this suffering. I would be so furious. I would be angry. I would want revenge and all of these things. So it starts, there's a sort of recognition of what the human cost would be of these things. But it ignores the fact that we have, unfortunately, vast experience of people who have been wrongfully incarcerated and have been released. And that experience teaches us that almost uniformly, when people who are released after an unjust imprisonment, they are grateful to be released. They are forgiving. They want to get on with their lives. They are by no means a danger to society. That it is never weakening or a mistake to fix a wrong. And so, why we're afraid of that, it's just this kind of shadowy guilt that we carry with us that, we deserve to be punished for what we've done. But that's not, and if that's what's keeping us from doing the right thing, that's adolescent. That's frankly adolescent.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just guilt. I think it's a shame factor because we are in a country that's kind of puritanical. I mean, a lot of the religions in this country are very punitive. And so, the idea is that if you're good and Santa will come. And if you're bad, people are watching and you're going to burn, man.
Right.
So the idea of, it's a human frailty and admitting sadism. I mean, it's painful. I mean, that's why I really want there to be a platform for people who have had moral injury, who have tortured, because I don't think we're even willing to listen to them, and we need to listen to them because we need to know what happens to people under certain circumstances and how their sadism just comes out and is very dangerous.
In some cases, it's not sadism. I mean, it's just, it's simply people who are ordered to do things,
Okay. All right. So it's detachment.
Yeah. And detachment, but, but yeah, you're absolutely right about hearing those voices too, because they carry trauma.
Yeah.
And that trauma, trauma is so deeply and widely distributed through US society. And, just the really good example is, our national conversation about the Iraq war, where it is now that I think 80% of American people agree that the Iraq war was a mistake. Donald Trump was elected president, and when he was campaigning the first time, he was denouncing the Iraq war, and he said it was a mistake at the time. He's absolutely consistent about that. But we have not had the conversation about the awfulness that comes with that statement, right? The incredible human cost that inflicted, how cataclysmically disruptive it was for that country and that region, and we need to do that. But now we're just walking around, as you say, with shame, right? A knowledge that was wrong and bad, but that quickly translates into fear. And Trump was a master at sort of making that switch. He would cite these, errors, but then invoke the menace that's out there, coming for us. And
he loved torture. I mean, he was fine with torture.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, it's a very twisted thing, but it is remarkable for somebody who's my age to have grown up through the Vietnam anti-war movement when I was a child, to know that, a country that went through that process that was so wrenching, didn't learn enough from that process to be able to have a better conversation about the equally catastrophic Iraq war. Something that we like with Vietnam at the end, almost all of us agree was a horrible, 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 unjustified use of violence. Um, that's some serious work that we've got to do.
Yeah, serious. Well, I just really want to thank you. This is Larry Siems. I thank you for all your work, and I thank you for Guantanamo Diary, where I got interested in meeting you. And please say hello and thank you to Mohamedou, because I think he has helped my own humanity, and I think he stands to help that of many all over, and especially in this country.
Same with me. Absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting.
Okay.